Good afternoon. I'm Antonio Parenti, the head of the representation of the European Commission here in Italy, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome once more for a further event of the Festival della Diplomazia here at the Spazio Europa, and to welcome an incredibly prestigious panel today to discuss the in search of European alternative solution to international sanctions. You have indeed an incredible panel and an even more incredible chair of this panel, as Professor Quercia is clearly an expert on the matter. I would like to welcome all the participants to this event. President Pier Francesco Gaggi, the president of ABI-Lab, Jonathan Ackenbroek, head of the ECFR Task Force for Protecting Europe from Economic Coercion, Maria Elena Uta, who is the Charge d'Affaires at the Venezuelan Embassy, and then let me also give a particular welcome to Maria Chiara Malaguti, president of UNIDROIT, professor of international law, and definitely last but not definitely least, Sabine Weyand, who is the Director General of DigiTrade, and for a long time a colleague of mine, and now my former boss in the European Commission. So welcome to all of you. I'm sure it will be a fascinating panel and a fascinating discussion afterwards, and I'm glad that this can be done here at Spazio Europa. So once more, thank you very much. I'm sure it will be interesting to listen, and without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Professor Quercia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Antonio Parenti, for introducing and hosting here this event of Festival della Diplomazia. Thank you for our guests. Just some rule of engagement of our work today. My name is Paolo Quercia. I am director of GeoTrade, that is a geoeconomic magazine that deals exactly with the issue of sanctions, economic restrictions, and economic coercion. So I will really have a lot of things to listen from what you say. But in order to prepare the ground for all these our thoughts, we are really proud to have with us Ms. Sabine Weyand. She's Director General for DigiTrade of the European Commission. And we know very much that the European Union is such a powerful trading bloc. This is one of the most relevant capacity, international capacity of the Union. This capacity has been federated very many years ago from the member states, so that we really have a union that is capable to act as an actor, an important actor on the international stage. And when this, we have the different globalization happening, change of trends in the globalization, we think that this is a powerful tool for European Union to have what is called this strategic autonomy. What is a strategic autonomy or geopolitical posture of the European Union? Probably this will have very much to do on the competence of the Directorate General that Sabine Weyand is directing. So I give her the floor to introduce and also to possibly explain us in, unfortunately, only 10 minutes, but then we have another round of talks to explain us how the strategic autonomy concept can be declined in the international trade. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Quercia, and good afternoon from Brussels. I'm very happy to be with you. I'm less happy to be so only virtually. I would have much preferred to be with you in beautiful Rome, but that will have to wait for another day. Now, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to introduce this panel today. I understand that the overall theme of your Festival della Diplomazia is ready for the unexpected. And I think that is very much the question that we've also been asking ourselves about EU trade policy. And that is perhaps where I would like to start, because what we see is we are living through a tectonic shift in global power relations and in the architecture of global governance. What used to be a rules-based order based on predictable norms and stable procedures is now being undermined by the same countries that once helped to shape it. And it is also destabilized by new emerging actors. So what we see is that multilateral institutions like the WTO, on which we have been relying to police international trade relations, are now mired in conflict and are not allowed to reform. And we see that the rule of law is increasingly replaced by the law of the jungle and a power-based approach to trade relations. If you couple these challenges, these structural tectonic shifts in the global architecture with the pandemic, you have a perfect storm. And there is a particular challenge for trade policy because traditionally, trade policy was seen as a very powerful tool to create economic opportunities, to create growth, to lead to job creation. But today, the expectations are much higher. Yes, trade is still expected to do all these things, but it is also expected to help deal with climate change, to position the EU strategically as a geopolitical player. It is increasingly used, or the expectation is that it is increasingly used also to promote human rights, core labor standards, etc. And the danger is, of course, that when you have one policy instrument, trade policy, which is supposed to accomplish multiple objectives, you have a problem because you face difficult trade-offs. And that is where the concept of open strategic autonomy comes in. And I know that when we came with this has triggered quite a lot of discussions, people saying that isn't this a contradiction in terms, open strategic autonomy, which one is it? Well, I would argue that the merit of the term open strategic autonomy is that it brings out into the open the need to find a balance between these different objectives. From our point of view, open strategic autonomy is a mindset. It's a mindset in order that should allow us to shape the world around us, to continue to reap the benefits of the global opportunities, while at the same time assertively defending our interests, protecting our economies from unfair trade practices, and ensuring a level playing field. On the one hand, that means building on our key strength, openness. After all, the EU is the biggest importer and exporter of goods and services. In 2019, the EU exported over 3.1 trillion euros worth of goods and services, and we imported 2.8 trillion euros worth of goods and services. So we have a surplus of 300 billion per year. Among the large economies, the EU is the one where trade accounts for the largest share of the economy. And that matters because it creates jobs. EU exports support 38 million jobs in the EU. That is 1 in 5 EU jobs. And that number has grown very importantly over the last decade. Openness is equally important to secure access to critical raw materials, for instance, the ones we need for the green transition. But we've also seen in the pandemic that international supply chains are essential in order to get medical and pharmaceutical supplies. And now that we are trying to turn the corner of the pandemic, openness will become even more fundamental, especially given that 85% of global growth will happen outside the EU in the next decade. And now, of course, open trade depends on the right global rules. And as I said, the WTO is currently mired in conflict and not really able to do its job. We have published a detailed EU agenda for reform of the WTO, and we will leave no stone unturned to make sure that the next ministerial conference at the end of November sets us and the organization on a pathway towards a meaningful reform process. At the same time, we will continue to build on our network of bilateral trade agreements, the largest in the world. We have 46 agreements with 78 countries and territories. And we are also looking into options of further partnerships where this makes sense. But we also see that it is not enough to negotiate agreements. They also need to be ratified in order to be implemented. Now, I think this is something where we face a challenge in the EU. And we have the European Council meeting in Brussels today, and tonight, hopefully, the leaders will have a discussion in order to see how we can move forward with the ratification of agreements, which is essential for the credibility of the EU as a global actor. Now, obviously, and here I come more to the theme of this panel, our trade policy is only as strong as our tools for implementation and enforcement. And that is where the autonomy part of open strategic autonomy comes in. We need to strengthen our capacity to defend ourselves and to level the playing field if others do not play by the rules. So we need to provide an effective response against any unfair and harmful practices. And I just wanted to give you a few examples. Almost a year ago, the Foreign Direct Investment Screening Regulation entered into force to safeguard our security and public order. This year, we proposed a legal instrument to address distortions created by foreign subsidies in our internal market. We are also finally, may I say, making progress in the discussions on the international procurement instrument. It is a crucial offensive instrument to open up third country markets. And we are now, and I think that is what you will probably hear a lot about in the panel discussion now, we are now in the process of finalizing a proposal for a new anti-coercion instrument, which will provide us with an effective framework to deal with coercive actions undertaken by third countries. The focus here is, first of all, on deterring coercion and on ending coercion when it happens. But where necessary, the right countermeasures should be available quickly in order for the instrument to be credible. These are just some of the autonomous measures that we are now developing. For me, it was, however, important to put this element of the autonomous measures into the overall framework of our open strategic autonomy, because balance is everything in this. Autonomy without openness risks leading to protectionism, and that would be a huge mistake for the EU, whose prosperity depends very much on the openness and on our engagement with the rest of the world. Just like openness would be unsustainable if we didn't have the means to defend ourselves against unfair practices by others. So that's why, for me, it is very important to look at these issues together, to look at the balance between the different components. And last but not least, while trade is a very powerful tool, as Professor Guarzia recalled at the beginning, we also need to be clear that it cannot solve every problem under the sun. And especially if we are looking at strategic autonomy in a wider foreign policy sense, we also need to develop other instruments at the EU level in order to promote our ability to shape the world around us. So trade policy is a very important, perhaps the most important, and certainly the most developed tool in our toolbox, but it cannot be the only one if we want to live up to what I described as the tectonic shifts that we are currently living through. Let me stop here, and I'm looking forward to the comments by the panelists and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Sabine Weyand. Actually, I subscribe completely this invitation also to be careful of the danger to over-rely on trade policy in the case of coercion, because coercion is using economic tools to achieve a political goal. So also how you can respond on it, not only with economic tools. The response should be somehow political, including the tools of trade, of course. And thank you very much for introducing us to this very complex issue of how to defend the European economic sovereignty when, unfortunately, trade happens to be weaponized or just attached to goals other than economic goals. We have seen at WTO this happening a lot, that trade once was only an instrument to create growth and some political openness. Today, it became attached to many other non-economic goals. we can clearly see how this positive ones as also human rights, labor issues, environment, strategic and ideological goals. So this should be carefully handled, and I think this is the important starting point for our discussion. But let me go further, giving the floor to Mr. Jonathan Hackenbroek. He's the head of European Council on Foreign Relations Task Force for Protecting Europe from Economic Coercion. And actually is just the right man for us, because his task force produced recently a report that proposes different tools to respond to economic coercion. And so I would ask him to shortly present your findings, but also to explain why what's wrong with the present tool that there are, and what could be the new ones to be introduced in our toolbox. Please, I would like if you could do this in 7-8 minutes.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone in Rome. Hello from Berlin. I'd also love to be there in person, but unfortunately I'm sitting here in stormy and rainy Berlin. But very happy to be on the panel and alongside all these distinguished panelists. And I think Ms. Vajan touched on a lot of things already on what the problem is that we're facing, the changing world, the fact that a lot of growth is going to happen in the next decade, is going to happen outside of Europe, the fact that many countries that intertwine state action and geopolitics much more than we would like it to be the case, are gaining increasingly more weight in the global economy than the G7 and then the EU, relatively speaking, and that the links that link countries together, and especially economic links, are the number one arena for a new great power competition, and that makes especially places like the EU that want to stay open and that rely on exports and or on trade in general with other parts of the world, increasingly vulnerable and especially vulnerable. So that's the sort of scene, the setting in which we started to work first with the German and the French governments and German and French private sector, and now with a range of EU member states and private sectors on this question of what are concrete options for Europeans to strengthen themselves against economic coercion. And the number one finding is, and I think this is very much in line with what Ms. Vajan just said, is that the best defense against economic coercion is definitely our own strength and openness. The best argument you have if there's a third country using, be it punitive tariffs, sanctions, other tools, other more regulatory tools to coerce European companies and thereby indirectly change European policies. The best argument you can have is a strong, innovative economy and dependencies, and which create dependencies in the other way around as well, and which simply incentivize finding multilateral and cooperative solutions. However, having said that, what we identified was that there was still a need to strengthen the EU's defenses. And we looked at a number of issues. Also, some of them are more structural, like digital currencies, a digital euro. But we also looked at how fairly creatively how European competition policy might, even going beyond the subsidy, the overhaul on foreign subsidies that Ms. Vajan mentioned, might have to adapt or could adapt in theory. That was a more creative approach. But two very concrete policy options came out as definitely among possibly the most feasible, or in any case options that promise to be effective, realistic at the same time, without going into areas like treaty change or politically unviable areas. And these two were one, what we first called a collective defense mechanism, and two, an EU resilience office. And the collective defense mechanism is a sort of is very similar to the idea that the Commission is now pursuing and will be proposing in December as part of this anti-coercion instrument. So I'll just refer to it as anti-coercion instrument now, of course. But the idea of collective defense being that if Europeans want to have an effective deterrent against economic coercion, then it will be by leveraging their joint strength and the strength of the single market, and not by being all by themselves, either as a small member state or, as the saying goes, a big member state that hasn't realized that it's also small on the global stage. And very specifically, this idea of collective defense would be the idea is that the EU could leverage countermeasures, significant countermeasures, only in grave cases of economic coercion against an EU member state, and that the mere fact of having that possibility for this specific for the specific situation of economic coercion, not as a trade defense, a classic trade defense instrument, would go a long way in triggering dialogue and make it more likely that we can actually resolve a certain situation with a third country in dialogue and in finding a compromise on an issue, rather than but because the EU would show that it would come at a cost for a third country to impose punitive measures on the EU. And the gap that we've identified is sort of fourfold for this instrument. One is that we don't necessarily have a fully satisfying answer or response when trade is being used as a weapon with the explicit, or implicit goal, but clearly with the strategic goal to change our policies, not to gain a trade advantage, not to engage in unfair trade practices, but where the goal really is to change our policies. To give you an example, the Chinese ambassador in Berlin was publicly talking about tariffs on German car exports to China when Germany was considering to exclude or not Huawei from building the German 5G network. Clearly, an issue of sovereignty and security for the German state, and a policy decision that one could argue this threat was meant to influence. A second one is swiftness, and that's currently the EU may not be able to act very swiftly at the moment to economic coercion, because a WTO procedure in any case takes a long time, and if there is a final decision at all, and we need to be able to act swiftly, because the reality of economic coercion is that if you're trying to influence a certain policy, then you're going to try to you have a few weeks or months within which we wouldn't have a WTO decision yet, but within those weeks or months, a decision like the 5G network, but also whether to leverage a certain tax, like France's digital tax, when Donald Trump threatened to put punitive tariffs on France for imposing such a tax. That decision gets taken within a few weeks or months, and we don't have a tool to necessarily that can respond that quickly. Thirdly, gray zone tools. If we look at the situation that Australia has found itself in, you could imagine, in any case, that especially China uses measures against the EU that may on the surface, or not just on the surface, be legal and within the WTO's rulebook, but when the way they get imposed and when they do get imposed is clearly after a policy decision and clearly to punish for a certain policy decision. And fourthly, if economic coercion is conducted very well, a third country will always try to divide the EU rather than to unite all 27 member states jointly against that action. And to all of that, we thought we needed a response, and this collective defense mechanism we thought was one. And I'll just mention on the countermeasures specifically that you could imagine punitive, not in response to a punitive tariff or other economic coercion, you could imagine a counter tariff, investment restrictions to access to the EU's public procurement market. But what we also want to emphasize, and what came out of our task force work, was that if there's one lesson of Trump's policies towards China, then it's probably that tariffs may not be something that impress Beijing very much. They may, but they may also not, and that change policies, or trigger a successful dialogue and cooperation. So we believe that that one big leverage the EU might have can be technology and withholding certain technology to a third country, for example, China. And that would be an important countermeasure to include under such an anti-coercion instrument. And I'll just say 2 sentences about the Resilience Office, and I'll immediately stop. A second measure, apart from this collective defense mechanism, we thought was absolutely necessary or very important in any case, was to have a strategic unit above the directorates general within the Commission, to strategically, that's why we call it a Resilience Office, to strategically monitor the situation and also have an idea of what all DGs need to coordinate the different economic tools that we have and the different analyses being done in the different DGs within the Commission, to have a real strategic overview of what's going on in the front of economic coercion and possibly geoeconomics more widely. And you could add a few analytical tools possibly to the toolbox, but mostly, of course, the Commission has a wide range and is very well equipped in terms of analysis of the situation. But pulling it all together at a high level place within the Commission above the DGs seemed very important from our work, and could help to make the Commission more geopolitical and more strategic, or even more, should I say? So with that, would be happy to go into some of the details, but I think I've vastly exceeded my time. So thanks so much for the invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you to Jonathan Hackenbroek. And we will, of course, go to see your report also to know more about the issue you mentioned. But I now proceed further to give the floor to Mr. Pierfrancesco Gaggi, who is Director for International Activities of the Italian Banking Association. And this is very important to hear your voice, the voice of the industry, of the banking industry, because this is crucial in any effective instruments used to coerce or to protect economies. We know that most of the game is played at financial level. So what is the point of view from the banking market and how to avoid economic coercion, but also to keep the banking market functioning as an economic market and not to weaponize it?
Thank you, Mr. Quercia, Professor Quercia, Paolo. It's a pleasure, and let me thank also the organizer of the festival to having invited me to this interesting roundtable. That is really interesting for me because I had just now the opportunity to learn something more about the issue of the anti-coercion instruments. That is something that we are very interested in, but unfortunately we were not so aware about the tendency or the lines that the Commission was going to take. We took part into the consultation, and we are very eager to know which will be the proposal by the Commission on such an important point. We attach the utmost importance to the point of the role of our union, of the European Union and its autonomy. And we claim that a very high level of autonomy is played by the European Union as to the whole economic environment, including also the financial environment as well. And this is one of the points that, let me say, was quite a weak point in the blocking regulation as it was written and as it was also amended. And this is the reason why the banks in Europe were pretty worried about the potential use of the regulation, because in our reading of the regulation as it was, banks as the channel for settling the transactions were the weak part of the chain, and could be considered liable of their decision of not settling the transactions made by corporates that would decide to make deals with Iran. And while the regulation had in its purpose to protect these corporates, on the other side, the same regulation created a sort of obligation on behalf of banks of settling, in any case, those transactions. And the weak point of this reasonment is that for banks, for any kind, let me say, any level of bank throughout Europe nowadays, it is not possible to work in the financial environment without dealing with dollars. And we all know that this is the problem. This was the problem with the regulation concerning Iran. So while a company, a corporate, can decide to work only with countries that are hit partially by sanctions or by third countries' sanctions, without getting any potential harm to their activity, for a bank, this is not possible, because all banks have to, 80% of the international export-import business is settled in dollar. All banks have to deal with dollars, and all banks have to maintain a number of corresponding accounts with US banks. And this makes really impossible for those banks not to take into account the decisions or the threats or the coercion mechanism and instruments used by US. This makes, unfortunately, impossible for banks not to take them into account. So we fully understand the role of international sanctions, also financial sanctions, when they are very well targeted against specific financial institutions, against specific persons, but it comes to be very very difficult to deal with these sanctions when they are spread in a wider target. And this brought us to think when I say brought us, in this case, I mean, especially we at the Italian Banking Association, we thought that one solution that is highly political as a solution could be the involvement of the European financial institution in settling those transactions put in place by corporates who want to make their deals, their businesses with the countries that are under sanctions from third countries. That means that, for instance, transactions, that is something that was partially put in place by through the Instex instrument or the Swiss initiative, but more realistically, in terms of practical solution, I don't see why this kind of transactions couldn't be settled through, for instance, the European Central Bank. Putting, well, of course, I fully understand the delicacy of such a solution that is highly politically delicate and that must be built very cautiously. But at the end, do we want a political solution for the issue of the sanctions? Well, I think that this solution must be put in place by the institutions, and it should be not put on behalf of part of the corporates, of the enterprises, and we used to say that also banks are enterprises, so it cannot be put on the burden of these solutions, cannot be put at the onus of the banks. So our proposal is to find political solutions that allow corporates who want to continue to open their businesses with countries that are subject to sanctions from third countries to settle these transactions through international or European, in our case, European financial institutions, public financial institutions. So this is a proposal that I think it could be taken into consideration for this further discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to Francesco Gaggi for this contribution, very, very important, I think. Basically, Instex was not enough. We need to increase the level of the, since the stake, what is at stake is very important, so we have to have probably the level needed is higher and is something closer to the central banks, at least from the banking point of view. But thank you very much for this. And we now are very pleased to give the floor to Professor Maria Chiara Malaguti. She's president of Unidroit. And we would like also to put into the picture what's the role of private and public international law in the issue of economic coercion. Is also an issue of economic force played for and against, or we have other legal instruments, judicial instruments that can be used to protect the economic rights of the states and companies to protect from economic coercion. Please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this. I was listening, it was extremely interesting what I heard. In fact, you know, the contribution of law, it's, I mean, I have to admit that even the contribution of law is not fully satisfactory in the sense that for the way legal orders interact, it's not easy to find a solution that could indeed work well for all possible context, and especially to address all different issues that we have seen in this scenario and that were addressed. I I think that there are two aspects that can be considered, and also from practice. On the one side, I see a movement in terms of jurisdiction. I don't want to be too technical because it's not the right time and the right place to do so. But indeed, there is case law, and there are some decisions also, in particular from the European Court of Justice, that can help at least to try to reduce the effects of some measures undertaken in other legal orders. There is a sort of battle, if I can say, that is going on, not specifically on sanctions, but on other issues involving international investments, where indeed it's not the same kind of topics, but it has at least a political similarity in the expectation by the European Court of Justice to try to limit the effects of agreements or even unilateral measures that are taken outside of Europe. So you might work on the concept of jurisdiction and try somehow to limit the effects. As I said, we do have some case law we can build upon. It's not really the final solution because as it was mentioned now, of course, every court or every legal system can influence its own territory. So as soon as you need to be outside that territory, it is extremely difficult to try to implement the decisions that were taken in the other legal system. So in parallel, the other instrument where law has tried to develop some tools was in connection with protection of human rights, and protection of human rights in the sense of protection of due process. So basically what you see, not only from the case law in Luxembourg, but also from the case law in Strasbourg, from the European Court of Human Rights, you also see attempts to reduce the effects of these measures on the individuals that were put in blacklist. So you can still try to mitigate the effects. I must say these are both ways that might be promising, but still in a limited understanding. So to solve possibly some issues, or in any event to mitigate the general issues or the general risks that arise from those issues. So on the opposite, what I think would be, for the future, it was extremely interesting what was said by Ms. Weyand, not only specifically on sanction, but on what all the attitude that the European Commission is having in its trade law. And one way is the way they normally work on, we all together normally work on international trade agreements, where you can use those tools to put conditionality or to impose by negotiation rules that also limit, for instance, the use of economic tools for political reasons. So you can, and this is what has been done in many of the latest agreements, especially when these were regional, you try to impose some conditions on some limitation that the counterparty will be ready to accept. Of course, it's a matter of negotiation. Some attempts were made even inside the WTO some decades ago, I would say. This didn't work and is not possibly working today in the specific situation that is it's somehow blocking the works, some of the works of the WTO right now. But in terms of individual regional agreements, that might be a tool to be used to impose some reciprocal conditions. And the second aspect, so this would be negotiation state to state or region to region, which is even more interesting in my understanding. And then there is the other aspect. I think that the world is changing so much in terms of digitalization and so that now it is extremely difficult to say which law applies to any specific phenomenon or specific circumstances. So you could work, I think the real tool here would be working with the private sector. Private companies and public sector working together to find solutions to this specific problem, or how to possibly locate or include in private tools, in contractual tools, instruments to protect also the company against this kind of risk. So I think law at this stage could help, in addition to what has been attempted until now, with these two tools. On the one side, working on the negotiation on regional agreements, which are ready for this, because I mean, we already have, as it was said, many other elements inside the agreements that would oblige to some sort of trade-off. So also negotiating trade-off, and on the other side, the role of the private sector. It's not only that the private sector is victim to some inconsistency, but they could play a role in a positive way, trying to help to find the right solution. So I would say, taking into account also private law and this usual public-private cooperation that is now one of the main features of even trade law to some extent. So I would say law could contribute that way, especially in Europe, because it is indeed Europe that is trying to support this kind of principles in also in trade. I think I can stop here because of time.
But thanks a lot, really, because it was really needed to see the problem from this perspective as well. But now we would like to have another perspective, because we are very glad to have with us Maria Elena Uzzo. She's chargée d'affaires from the Venezuelan embassy in Italy. And of course, it's important to hear what she wants to share with us, because we know Venezuela is under heavy US sanctions and less heavy, but still significant European sanctions or restrictive measures. So we would like to know from you what is the result of this economic restriction on Venezuelan economy and society, but also what instruments the Venezuelan government has adopted to face this. Please.
Buon pomeriggio. Farò la traduzione subito dopo. I will do the translation. I will read the text by the chargé d'affaires in English. Buon pomeriggio. Ringrazio il dottor Bartolomucci e tutto lo staff del Festival della Diplomazia per avermi invitato a prendere parola e parte a questo panel e poter condividere insieme ad autorevoli specialisti, che saluto, sulle sanzioni, alcuni dati sul tema in search of European alternative solution to international sanctions. Il mio contributo come rappresentante del Venezuela in Italia è informare sull'impatto delle stesse sui diritti umani e pertanto sul diritto allo sviluppo come esperienza vissuta nel nostro Paese. Good afternoon. I thank Dr. Bartolomucci and all the staff of Festival della Diplomazia for inviting me to participate in this panel to share, together with renewed specialists in sanctions, some data on the topic in search of European alternative solution to international sanctions. My contribution as the representative of Venezuela in Italy is to inform on the impact of sanctions on human rights and on the right to development as lived experience in our country. Il Venezuela gode di una posizione strategica e in tutto il corso della sua storia moderna ha avuto una rilevanza geostrategica inestimabile come paese produttore di materia prima. È il paese con la più grande quantità di riserve petrolifere al mondo e l'ottavo paese con la più grande quantità di riserve di gas.
Il valore delle sue riserve auree supera il prodotto interno lordo del Cile o della Danimarca. Il valore delle sue riserve di ferro supera il PIL del Messico o della Spagna. Il valore delle sue riserve di diamanti supera il PIL del Paraguay o della Bolivia. E inoltre possiede grandi quantità di coltan tra gli altri minerali.
Venezuela enjoys a relevant position and throughout its modern history has had an invaluable geostrategic significance as a commodity-producing country. Venezuela is the country with the largest amount of oil reserves in the world and the 8th country with the largest amount of gas reserves. The value of its gold reserves exceed the gross domestic product of Chile or Denmark. The value of its iron reserves exceed the GDP of Mexico or Spain, and the value of its diamond reserves exceed the GDP of Paraguay or Bolivia. And there are also large quantities of coltan among other minerals.
Le misure coercitive unilaterali, nel caso specifico della Repubblica Bolivariana del Venezuela, sono state applicate illegalmente da Stati perché, a differenza di quelle autorizzate dal Consiglio di sicurezza dell'ONU, non si fondano su base giuridica. In effetti, dal 2015 il Venezuela ha subito più di 430 misure coercitive unilaterali che hanno bloccato il commercio estero e privato contro tutti i principi legali di sovranità. Il blocco economico contro il Venezuela è stato avviato a partire dal 2016 ed ha causato danni per 350 miliardi di dollari in produzione di beni e servizi e anche centinaia di morti.
The unilateral coercive measures, in the specific case of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, are illegally applied by states because, unlike those authorized by UN Security Council, they are not founded on legal basis. Since 2015, Venezuela has suffered more than 430 unilateral coercive measures, which have blocked foreign and private trade against all legal principles of sovereignty. The economic blockade against Venezuela started in 2016 and caused damage for $350 billion in the production of goods, services, and also a few hundred dead.
Le sanzioni hanno inoltre limitato i settori produttivi del Paese, impedendo sia l'importazione che l'esportazione di beni, alimenti e medicinali. Inoltre hanno compromesso la manutenzione delle raffinerie del Paese, tra le più grandi al mondo, sviluppate con tecnologia nordamericana, con la drastica diminuzione del rifornimento di benzina in un Paese produttore di petrolio. L'impatto è paragonabile, secondo gli esperti, solo a un Paese sottoposto a una guerra convenzionale. A riguardo, si precisa che il Venezuela possiede più di 6 miliardi di dollari bloccati all'estero e la produzione di petrolio è diminuita del 99%.
The sanctions have also limited the country's productive sectors, preventing both import and export of goods, food, and medicines. They also compromised the maintenance of the country's refineries, among the largest in the world, developed with North American technology, with a drastic decrease in the supply of gasoline in an oil-producing country. According to the experts, the impact is comparable only to a country subjected to a conventional war. In this regard, Venezuela has $6 billion blocked abroad, and oil production has decreased by 99%.
Le misure coercitive unilaterali applicate sul Venezuela hanno causato un impatto significativo sulla popolazione, misurato in termini di effetti sulla vita e sulla salute di milioni di persone, e in particolare sui gruppi più vulnerabili, condizionando la tutela dei diritti umani, lo sviluppo, la sovranità e la autodeterminazione del nostro popolo.
The unilateral coercive measures applied by the United States, Canada, and the European Union on Venezuela have caused a significant impact on the population, measured in terms of effects on the life and health of millions of people, and in particular on the most vulnerable groups, affecting the protection of human rights, the development, the sovereignty, and the self-determination of our country.
Nello specifico, nell'ambito commerciale, le sanzioni hanno colpito moltissime imprese statali e private, navi e petroliere venezuelane operanti in 26 paesi del mondo, occasionando anche disagi a qualunque cittadino venezuelano abbia un conto bancario all'estero. Questi dati collocano il Venezuela tra i primi paesi al mondo per numero di sanzioni.
In detail, in the commercial sector, sanctions affected many Venezuelan state and private companies, ships and oil tankers operating in 26 different countries around the world, causing disruption to Venezuelan citizens who have bank accounts abroad. This data places Venezuela among the first country in the world for number of sanctions.
Nel settore della salute è opportuno ricordare che a partire dal 2019 è stato interrotto un progetto di cooperazione sanitaria tra l'Associazione Italiana per il Trapianto del Midollo Osseo, ATMO, e la società petrolifera statale Petróleos de Venezuela, che ha dato l'opportunità a 488 pazienti venezuelani, l'80% in età pediatrica, di ricevere cure gratuite e aveva reso possibile 397 trapianti di midollo osseo in Italia. La banca portoghese Novo Banco ha congelato al Venezuela conti correnti per circa 1,5 miliardi di dollari, includendo i pagamenti per questo accordo di cooperazione.
In the healthcare sector, it is necessary to point out that since 2099 has been interrupted an healthcare cooperation project between the Italian Associazione per il Trapianto di Midollo Osseo ATMO and the state oil company Petróleos de Venezuela. This project gave the opportunity to 488 Venezuelan patients, the 8% in pediatric age, to receive a free treatment and made possible 397 bone marrow transplants in Italy. The Portuguese bank Novo Banco froze Venezuela's current account for approximately $1.5 billion, including payment for this health cooperation agreement.
In quanto alla gestione della pandemia di Covid-19, il denaro investito per l'acquisto di vaccini attraverso il sistema COVAX, al quale il Venezuela ha aderito, è stato bloccato e il Paese ha dovuto fare appello all'ONU. Nel 2020 Citibank ha bloccato la disponibilità di beni depositati dal Venezuela per un importo di 342 milioni di dollari che servivano per l'acquisto di vaccini, mentre il Fondo Monetario Internazionale ha negato 5 miliardi di dollari per far fronte alla pandemia.
As for the management of the COVID-19 pandemic, the money invested for the purchase of vaccines through the COVAX system, which Venezuela joined, was blocked, and the country had to appeal to the UN. In 2020, Citibank blocked the availability of assets deposited by Venezuela for an amount of $342 million, which would have been used for the purchase of vaccines, while the International Monetary Fund denied $5 billion to deal with the pandemic.
Lo scorso anno l'Alto Commissario per i diritti umani dell'ONU, Michelle Bachelet, nel suo rapporto annuale ha riconosciuto l'impatto negativo delle misure coercitive unilaterali e ne ha richiesto l'abolizione, rendendo nota l'esistenza di elementi per ritenere che tali misure implicano crimini contro l'umanità, in conformità con le disposizioni dello Statuto di Roma e in linea con il deferimento presentato dal Venezuela alla Corte Penale Internazionale. Il relatore speciale delle Nazioni Unite per lo studio dell'impatto negativo delle misure coercitive unilaterali sul godimento dei diritti umani, Elena Doan, nel suo rapporto finale sulla visita in Venezuela ha dimostrato, attraverso dati raccolti in loco, che le misure coercitive unilaterali imposte dagli Stati Uniti e dall'Unione Europea al Venezuela hanno un effetto devastante e dovrebbero essere riviste e revocate.
Last year, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, in her annual report, acknowledged the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures and called for their abolition, disclosing the existence of elements to believe that these measures involve crimes against humanity, in accordance with the provisions of the Rome Statute and in line with the referral presented by Venezuela to the International Criminal Court. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Study of the Negative Impact of Unilateral Coercive Measures on the Enjoyment of Human Rights, Alina Duhan, in her final report on the visit to Venezuela, demonstrated through data collected on site that the unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States and the European Union on Venezuela have a devastating effect and should be reviewed and lifted.
Sebbene le conseguenze e gli effetti sulla nostra popolazione e lo sviluppo del nostro Paese siano irreversibili, questo momento ci impegna a trovare alternative viabili in ambito giuridico. In contrasto con le misure coercitive unilaterali, il Venezuela ha intensificato il lavoro per promuovere lo sviluppo della popolazione. Il Paese, storicamente monoproduttore e dipendente dell'export del petrolio, ha fatto grandi passi verso la diversificazione degli introiti e della propria produzione attraverso la cooperazione e l'alleanza strategica con altri Paesi per garantire gli elementi fondamentali per il funzionamento del settore pubblico e privato del Paese.
Even if the consequences and effects on our population and on the development of our country are irreversible, this moment forced us to find viable alternatives in legal field. In contrast to the unilateral coercive measures, Venezuela intensified its work to promote population development. The country, historically a monoproducer and dependent on oil exports, has made great progress towards the diversification of revenues and its production through cooperation and strategic alliances with other countries to guarantee the fundamental elements for the functioning of the country's public and private sector.
Oggi il Venezuela è indirizzato verso un nuovo quadro normativo per gli investitori e per il commercio estero. La Commissione economica regionale dell'ONU per l'America Latina, nel suo ultimo rapporto, ha riferito che il Paese manterrà il suo PIL in contrazione nel 2021 e che registrerà nel 2022 un aumento dell'1%. E secondo l'Istituto di Finanzas Internazionales, il Paese avrà un aumento del PIL dello 0,3% nel 2021 e dell'1,3% nel 2022.
Today, Venezuela is heading towards a new regulatory framework for investors and for foreign trade. The UN Regional Economic Commission for Latin America, in its latest report, stated that the country will keep its GDP contraction in 2021 and that it will record a 1% increase in 2022. According to the Instituto de Finanzas Internacionales, the country will have a GDP increase of 0.3% in 2021 and 1.3% in 2022.
Il Venezuela sostiene il multilateralismo come un modo per raggiungere gli obiettivi comuni e superare le sfide. Per questo motivo ci auguriamo che il problema delle misure coercitive unilaterali possa essere ampiamente discusso, analizzato e approfondito, tenendo conto delle ripercussioni finanziarie, economiche e sociali e delle conseguenze dirette sulla popolazione. Vi ringrazio per l'ascolto.
Venezuela advocates for multilateralism as a way to achieve common goals and overcome challenges. For this reason, we hope that the problem of unilateral coercive measure can be widely discussed, analyzed, and deepened, taking into account the financial, economic, and social repercussion and the direct consequences on the population. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you for the translator as well. Now we are going to the end, to the closure of our meeting. So I think the best thing to do, unless Professor Malaguti and Dr. Gaggi, they don't want to say something, I would give the floor for around 5-7 minutes to Jonathan Achenbroich for wrapping up what we have been said and eventually to try to conclude from a European perspective this meeting. Jonathan, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone on the panel. Very interesting, and I agree with Maria Chiara on the need to do this in a sort of, or to have more dialogue on this in any case between the public and the private sectors. That's certainly an experience we made here with our task force, that it was very helpful to look at these issues and also possible responses from the perspectives of public sector, and public sector, you know, it might involve different departments. Foreign departments are important for these issues of economic coercion, just as our economics ministries, for instance. And then on the private sector side as well, to have a good sense of all the perspectives of all the actors involved. hit by economic coercion, but also concerned by the countermeasures that we might take, which once they are can be discussed, of course. And I'll just follow up on Francesco's points on this idea of, because it's something we looked at in quite some detail as well last year when US financial sanctions were being used, not just to cut European business off with Iran, but the Trump administration even went as far as many of you know, as putting the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, based in the Netherlands, on the SDN list, on the US SDN list, which in a context where she was investigating possible US war crimes for the International Criminal Court. And so we did look at this at an idea that came up in our discussions, and that we analyzed in quite some detail, of building a bigger, broader European export bank, public, probably fully public export bank that would exactly do what Francesco was suggesting, help with keeping payment channels open where from a European point of view, trade is legitimate and legal, of course, not any kind of trade, but where it's legitimate and legal, and where the EU sanctions regime allows for such trade. Now, going into the details, and if you will, there's a big difference here to Instex in the idea that we looked at, and in this being fully public, this idea of a European export bank, and much bigger, and therefore possibly also harder to sanction itself. That was the sort of idea, and of course the idea is appealing, and you can look at some of the technical details of how it could work, but we did nonetheless come across a lot of technical issues on the technical side that seem to make this proposal, from our point of view and from the research we have done, very difficult to implement in the end. And I think one of the main difficulties is, because of how important the dollar is to global financial flows, is the gateway to commercial banks between such a public bank. So how do you get, if such a public bank finances your exports to say Iran, because under European law you're engaging in legitimate and non-sanctioned trade, it's hard to find a commercial bank at the moment that will do that, or it's practically impossible. And an export bank, a public export bank, could facilitate such trade and settle and do the settlement that you can't do elsewhere. The difficulty then is, what do you do with the money that's on the export bank? As soon as you want to use it yourself as a European company within Europe, or outside of Europe, to purchase something else, to reinvest, or whatever you want to do with the money, that's when you hit then the interface again with the commercial banking world, where we think that most commercial banks would refuse to accept the funds from the export bank, because they are linked to what the US finds, at least when there's this non-alignment between US and European policies, like was the case under the Trump administration. Fines considers as sanctionable conduct, and a transaction that is subject to US sanctions. And because commercial banks would never risk getting shut out of the US market, it's just shifting the problem to a slightly different front, but we're still having quite a bit of trouble of finding technical solutions. It's one example that we identified, and that might be difficult. We sort of concluded that a lot of things can be imagined, but ultimately the question is how much political willingness is there, and how much will European governments say, we'll do whatever it takes to back this bank up politically, and do the necessary regulatory changes, and possibly make commercial banks accept those payments from the public bank. But that's a big and very difficult issue, of course. It's certainly from the points of view of many commercial banks, I would imagine. So you might have to compensate possibly them or companies that use the export bank. You need really high protection standards for the staff and for this bank, and then you're still not solving the issue of many European companies that are themselves active on the US market and the Chinese market or other markets at the same time, big corporates who wouldn't risk using such a bank anyhow, because they themselves, not indirectly through banks, but they themselves face punishment on third markets. So in the end, that option seemed very difficult. But we did, and I'll just conclude with this, we did also look at the blocking statute, where we think, and the Commission has launched a reform process for the blocking statute, where we think there's quite a bit of scope to improve the blocking statute, not least by making it easier to get waivers for European companies, but in exchange, asking European companies to provide more information to authorities, to EU authorities, so that a resilience office, as I mentioned, can make a much better strategic assessment of what's going on and possibly wage countermeasures, not against the European companies, as is currently the case under the blocking statute, but rather countermeasures against the third country that is using economic coercion against Europeans, and that would be the anti-coercion instrument or collective defense instrument. And I'll just say that from our point of view, or from my point of view, the blocking statute should increasingly also be about Chinese actions. If you look at some ever more Chinese laws that are in place, that I would call them squeezing laws, that make it illegal for a company active in China to comply with European sanctions or US sanctions, which is clearly, and imposes punishment on these companies, then we're clearly in a situation also with regards to Chinese export controls where European companies might be in a position to have to comply with regulations on the Chinese market that run counter core European interests and that make European policies difficult, which is the original situation that we're trying to regulate under the blocking statute, which is exactly that in the US, European companies were facing regulations and sanctions that cut off European trade from Iran. And you can see similar things at least being put in place now in China. And and I'll just point to the publication of the Commission's anti-coercion instrument proposal at the end of the year, which I think will be important for everyone to watch and see what the Commission will ultimately propose on countermeasures, and maybe keep it at that. And thank you once more, especially to Paolo and everyone for the invitation.
Thank you, Jonathan, very, very much. Thank you to you all. Of course, we couldn't solve the problem in this hour of discussion. This is a very old, the issue of economic sanctions and coercion is a very, very old issue, cannot be solved because it's basically rooted in international relations itself. As you know, the first case of economic sanctions happened during the Peloponnesian War, a long time ago. So somehow we have to live with it. We have to include it in the European Union external action, foreign policy. Of course, we have to protect European Union economic sovereignty. We have to protect our trade, our growth, in a world that, as the Director General said, is experiencing some tectonic shift. So we even don't know which are the rules we are actually playing. The political and economic relation. Actually, basically, these rules are under prescription, and of course, this is something so complex to handle in the short term. But we are happy to have been at least from Rome and from Berlin and from Brussels and from Venezuela. We have contributed to increase the the thoughts on this issue. And on behalf of the Festival della Diplomazia, again, I thank you all the speakers and the people who were following us here present in Rome in the office of the European Commission or online. Thank you to you all. Thanks.
Thank you all. Bye.
Goodbye.
Grazie.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your answer. Bye. Let's keep in touch.
Happy to, yes.